Welcome to our channel where we calmly unravel the profound stories hidden behind the facade of history. In the 1990s, Stephen Collins was America's perfect father, a gentle minister guiding millions with a warm smile. But reality wrote a much crueler script. Today, in 2026, there are no adoring fans, only the cold aisles of an Iowa grocery store. The television patriarch is now an unforgivable pariah, greeted only by the absolute disgust of those who once loved him. What kind of unspeakable acts could transform a beloved moral compass into a fallen idol, forcing an entire generation to turn their backs on him forever? It is a chilling realization that television does not just build heroes, it builds fortresses for dark secrets. The roots of this colossal deception begin far from Hollywood, buried in an era of elite privilege. Before we step back in time, please let us know where and what time you are watching. Share any untold facts in the comments, and kindly forgive any minor errors as we express our deepest sorrow for the heartbreaking reality of this story. The architecture of this perfect facade was not built overnight. The secret to how he maintained this illusion for so long lies in his early career. The 1990s was a decade defined by cultural fragmentation. Television networks were fiercely competing for demographics, leading to the rise of flawed characters and dysfunctional families as the new standard for drama. Shows featuring deeply flawed protagonists were dominating the ratings, reflecting a society increasingly comfortable with moral ambiguity. In this environment, the newly launched WB network, primarily known for teen-centric programming, took a calculated risk. They partnered with prolific producer Aaron Spelling, a man historically associated with glamorous soap operas, to create something entirely different, a sincere, wholesome family drama. When Stephen Collins accepted the role of Reverend Eric Camden, he was not merely taking a job, he was stepping into the ultimate psychological disguise. He recognized that the character offered a flawless, culturally bulletproof shield against any scrutiny of his private life. Playing a minister allowed him to wrap his own hidden deviance in the sacred cloth of religious and paternal authority. For a man harboring a decades-long history of predatory behavior, the network had unwittingly handed him the perfect camouflage. He essentially hid in plain sight, broadcasting his innocence to millions every single week. The premise was simple but culturally potent. It focused on a Protestant minister living in California with his wife and their growing brood of children. The show tackled societal issues, underage drinking, vandalism, peer pressure, and even gun violence, but always resolved them within the safe, controlled environment of the Camden household. At the center of this narrative ecosystem was the Reverend. He was designed to be the infallible anchor. When a teenager made a mistake, the Reverend was there with a stern but loving reprimand. When a community member faced a crisis, the Reverend provided a theological and practical roadmap to redemption. For the viewing public, particularly the middle-class demographic seeking refuge from the perceived moral decay of broader pop culture, this character was a revelation. He represented the father they wished they had, or the father they aspired to be. The audience formed a deep, parasocial bond with the man on the screen. In the pre-social media era, the lines between actor and character were heavily blurred. Viewers did not just see Stephen Collins reading lines from a script. They saw a genuine moral authority. The television set in the living room acted as a pulpit, and millions tuned in every week to receive their ethical instructions. This immense cultural trust is what makes the subsequent revelation so catastrophic. The collapse of Stephen Collins was not just a tabloid scandal, it was the shattering of a shared value system. When an actor who has built a career on morality is exposed for past misconduct, the betrayal encompasses the entire audience. It forces a painful reevaluation of instinct and judgment. How could millions of people, including network executives, casting directors, and loyal viewers, be so comprehensively deceived? The answer lies in the psychological armor that Collins wore, a facade constructed from elite education, physical stature, and a calculated aura of respectability. The turning point, the moment the facade shattered irreparably, occurred on the 7th of October 2014. The modern media landscape, unlike the tightly controlled public relations machinery of the 20th century, operates on the rapid, unfiltered dissemination of information. TMZ, a prominent celebrity news platform known for its aggressive acquisition of legal documents and insider media, published a clandestine audio recording. The audio quality was not pristine, but the voice was unmistakable. It was the same soothing, authoritative baritone that had delivered countless television sermons. However, the content of the recording was chilling. In a clinical, conversational tone, devoid of any discernible emotion or remorse, the voice detailed a history of exposing himself and engaging in inappropriate physical contact with multiple underage girls. The incidents he described spanned several decades. The audio recording exposed a horrifying reality. The voice of the predator was entirely indistinguishable from the voice of Reverend Eric Camden. Collins did not sound like a man gripped by panic or burdened by the weight of a lifelong sin. He sounded like a clinical administrator reviewing a mundane schedule. This calm, authoritative delivery shattered the illusion of his television persona, revealing the terrifying emptiness beneath his warm smile. He dissected his own predatory history with a supreme arrogance, completely detached from the devastating trauma he had inflicted upon his victims. It was the sound of a man who firmly believed his elite status made him immune to consequence. The cognitive dissonance experienced by the public was absolute. Here was the nation's television father calmly dissecting his own history of misconduct. The contrast between the visual memory of the benevolent Reverend Camden and the audio reality of a confessed perpetrator of misconduct created a cultural shockwave. It was an event that immediately redefined his entire legacy. The public was forced to confront the terrifying reality that the man who had spent 11 years preaching about the protection of innocence had actively participated in its destruction. Long before Seventh Heaven, Collins had established a public reputation for education, professionalism, and authority. Those qualities would later make the contrast between his public image and his admitted conduct especially difficult for audiences to reconcile. Stephen Weaver Collins was born in 1947, entering a post-World War II America that placed a premium on traditional stability and academic achievement. Raised in an environment that bridged the Midwestern sensibilities of Iowa and the cosmopolitan influence of New York, he was instilled with a commanding, patrician demeanor early in life. He did not possess the chaotic, unpredictable energy often associated with struggling artists. Instead, he projected the quiet confidence of the ruling class. His educational background provided the first layer of his impenetrable armor. He attended Amherst College, a prestigious liberal arts institution in Massachusetts known for its rigorous academic standards and wealthy, influential alumni network. Graduating cum laude, Collins secured a credential that immediately communicated intelligence, discipline, and moral seriousness. In the hierarchical structures of the mid-20th century, a degree from an institution like Amherst was not just an academic achievement. It was a character reference. It signaled to the world that this was a man of substance, someone who belonged in boardrooms and intellectual circles. Collins actively wielded this prestigious Amherst pedigree as a weapon of intimidation against anyone who might question his character. He cultivated a patrician demeanor that demanded immediate respect, ensuring that younger, less influential individuals would feel entirely powerless in his presence. By projecting the image of a highly educated, morally serious intellectual, he created a rigid power dynamic that isolated his victims. He knew that society instinctively trusts a man who speaks with measured eloquence and wears the unquestionable badge of Ivy League superiority. His intelligence was entirely channeled into maintaining this pristine, untouchable exterior. This academic pedigree smoothed his entry into the world of professional acting. When he transitioned to the theater, he did not start in the gritty, experimental fringes. He gravitated towards the established, respectable stages of Broadway. The theatrical community, while often romanticized as a bastion of bohemian freedom, is heavily reliant on perception. Casting directors and producers are constantly evaluating an actor's reliability. Can this person carry a multi-million-dollar production? Will they show up on time? Will they present a respectable face to the press? Collins answered all these questions affirmatively by simply existing. He was tall, conventionally handsome, and possessed a rich, resonant-speaking voice that commanded attention without appearing aggressive. He looked like a doctor, a lawyer, a politician, or a clergyman. He naturally inhabited roles of authority. In the 1970s Broadway scene, he built a reputation as a consummate professional. He avoided the public scandals, the substance abuse issues, and the erratic behavior that frequently derailed the careers of his contemporaries. Behind the curtains of 1970s Broadway, Collins was already living a highly structured double life. While his peers indulged in the loud, chaotic vices of the era, he maintained a chillingly disciplined focus on his career, deliberately cultivating a reputation for absolute reliability. This extreme professional control was a necessary counterweight to the uncontrolled compulsions he indulged in private. He built his trustworthy reputation piece by piece, ensuring that directors and producers saw only a dedicated craftsman. He understood that a spotless work ethic was the most effective way to deflect any suspicion from his dark, hidden reality. This is the insidious nature of the elite facade. Society is conditioned to look for danger in dark alleys and chaotic individuals. We are taught to be wary of the visibly unstable. We are not conditioned to suspect the well-dressed, highly educated professional who speaks with perfect diction and holds a steady job. By meticulously maintaining a spotless professional record and wrapping himself in the trappings of high culture, Collins created a blind spot. He understood the mechanics of trust. Trust in the entertainment industry is a currency, and Collins accumulated it in vast quantities. Directors trusted him with complex roles. Producers trusted him with their investments. And eventually, the American public would trust him with their children's moral education. This foundation of elite respectability was not accidental. It was the necessary prerequisite for a life lived in dual realities. The higher he climbed the ladder of social and professional prestige, the deeper the shadows became where his true nature resided. The early years of his career set the template for his entire existence. He learned that as long as he hit his marks, delivered his lines flawlessly, and maintained a polite, detached professionalism with his colleagues, no one would ask probing questions about his private life. The theater and early television environments provided him with a structured, disciplined world where he could perform the role of the perfect gentleman, while simultaneously harboring a pathology that would remain undetected for nearly 40 years. The stage was set, the persona was perfected, and the public was primed to accept the illusion without question. Furthermore, his physical appearance played a massive role in cementing his trustworthy image. In the visual medium of television and film, casting is often largely dictated by inherent physical traits. We assign moral attributes to physical characteristics, a phenomenon known as the halo effect. Collins possessed a symmetrical, open face. His jawline was strong, suggesting dependability, while his eyes conveyed a gentle intelligence. He did not possess the sharp, angular features often assigned to villains. He looked inherently decent. Casting directors look at hundreds of faces a week, relying on rapid psychological shortcuts to categorize actors. The shortcut for Collins was always honest, reliable, leading man. This physical and intellectual camouflage allowed him to navigate the highly social, often boundary pushing world of 1970s entertainment without raising alarms. The 1970s was an era defined by a breaking down of traditional social norms. The counterculture movement of the 1960s had bled into the mainstream, resulting in a general loosening of moral restrictions regarding sexuality and substance use within artistic communities. In a professional environment where many were openly embracing this newfound freedom, sometimes leading to chaotic and public self-destruction, his steadfast adherence to a more traditional, reserved presentation made him stand out as an anchor of stability. He was the actor you hired when you needed someone who would undoubtedly be sober and prepared for a morning rehearsal. He was the actor you trusted to handle complex, dialogue-heavy scenes without requiring extensive emotional management. This reputation for unwavering professionalism was his greatest asset. It created a firewall between his public actions and his private reality. The logic of his peers and employers was simple. A man this disciplined, this well-regarded, and this predictable in his professional duties could not possibly be harboring chaotic, destructive impulses in his private life. The earliest conduct Collins later acknowledged dated to the 1970s, when public awareness of inappropriate conduct involving minors was far less developed than it is today. Young people often face significant social and institutional barriers to reporting misconduct by older or respected adults. An individual operating in this era relied heavily on the societal mandate that children should not question authority figures, and that affluent, educated men were inherently trustworthy. Collins, armed with his Amherst degree and his rising theatrical prestige, was the very embodiment of the type of man society deemed beyond reproach. If a whispered accusation had ever surfaced, the institutional instinct of the era would have been to protect the respectable gentleman and doubt the accuser. Collins was a meticulous observer of these societal power imbalances, specifically targeting the profound voicelessness of youth. He operated with the chilling certainty that the cultural machinery of the era would automatically discredit a child while unconditionally protecting a distinguished actor. His actions were not moments of temporary weakness. They were calculated exploitations of a system he knew would never hold him accountable. He leveraged his growing fame and his imposing physical stature to ensure his victims understood the sheer impossibility of speaking out. He effectively trapped them in a web of adult authority that they had no means to escape. The power dynamic was entirely skewed in his favor. By the time Collins became a familiar television actor, he had accumulated many of the qualities audiences and employers associated with reliability. An elite education, a long professional record, a polished manner, and a history of playing figures of authority. Whether intentionally cultivated or not, that reputation later stood in stark contrast to the conduct he acknowledged. As he moved from the stages of New York to the television and film studios of Los Angeles, this mask would only become more sophisticated. The stakes would get higher, the audience would grow from thousands to millions, and the level of trust placed in him would reach unprecedented, almost religious heights. The foundation was laid not just for a successful acting career, but for one of the most devastating betrayals of public trust in modern media history. The man who would eventually be known as the moral compass of America was, from the very beginning, navigating the world with a compass that pointed toward profound moral corruption. The transition from respected stage actor to a fixture of the American living room required a specific vehicle, and that vehicle was conceptualized in the mid-1990s by a television network desperate for a distinct identity. The WB television network launched in 1995, backed by the massive corporate resources of Warner Brothers. Initially, the network struggled to find its footing against the established Big Four broadcasters. Their early strategy involved targeting a highly specific, younger demographic with programs that leaned heavily into teenage angst, supernatural romance, and urban comedies. While these shows garnered a cult following, they did not attract the broad, multi-generational viewership necessary to solidify the network as a major player. The executives at the WB realized they needed a program that could serve as a foundational anchor, a show that families could watch together without the constant need to monitor the content. They needed to tap into a demographic that felt alienated by the increasingly cynical tone of network television. To achieve this, they turned to Aaron Spelling. Spelling was a titan of television production, the mastermind behind globally successful series like Dynasty, Beverly Hills, 90210, and Melrose Place. His name was synonymous with glamorous excess, soap opera dramatics, and attractive young people engaging in scandalous behavior. Hiring Spelling to produce a sincere, faith-based family drama seemed entirely counterintuitive. However, Spelling possessed an uncanny instinct for the emotional pulse of the American audience. He understood that beneath the appetite for scandal, there was a profound, lingering nostalgia for the traditional family structures depicted in the television shows of the 1950s and 1960s. Spelling and series creator Brenda Hampton set out to engineer a modern equivalent of those classic family sitcoms, updated to address contemporary issues but firmly rooted in a conservative moral framework. The result was Seventh Heaven. The show was meticulously designed to be a safe harbor. The aesthetic was warm, featuring well-lit suburban homes, manicured lawns, and a general atmosphere of domestic tranquility. However, a show built on moral instruction requires a credible instructor. The casting of Reverend Eric Camden was the single most critical decision the producers faced. If the actor came across as too rigid, the character would seem authoritarian and unlikable. If the actor was too soft, the character would lack the necessary authority to resolve the weekly crises. The role demanded a specific alchemy, a man who could project divine authority, fatherly warmth, and intellectual rigor simultaneously. When Stephen Collins entered the casting process, he was the living embodiment of this required alchemy. He brought his decades of theatrical discipline, his polished Amherst diction, and his commanding yet gentle physical presence to the audition. He did not have to act like a respectable, educated patriarch. He had spent his entire adult life successfully convincing the world that he already was one. Upon securing the role, Collins did not just play Reverend Camden. He inhabited the archetype of the idealized American father. The character was written to be a Protestant minister, which added a layer of theological authority to his parental guidance. When Eric Camden spoke, he was not just offering a father's opinion. He was offering a divinely sanctioned perspective on right and wrong. The show tackled heavy subjects, but these issues were always filtered through the protective lens of the Camden family. The Reverend was always the ultimate arbiter, the man who possessed the wisdom to guide his flock back to the path of righteousness. The success of the program was astronomical. It became the highest-rated series on the WB network, running for an astonishing 11 seasons. For over a decade, Stephen Collins was a weekly fixture in millions of homes. This level of exposure fundamentally altered his relationship with the public. He ceased to be viewed as a working actor performing a script. In the minds of a vast segment of the audience, the boundary between Stephen Collins and Eric Camden dissolved completely. This parasocial phenomenon is common in television, where long-running characters become integrated into the viewer's daily routine. However, the specific nature of Collins' character elevated this bond to a dangerous level of reverence. People did not just like Reverend Camden, they trusted him with their moral anxieties. Viewers wrote letters to the network asking for the Reverend's advice on real-life family problems. Collins was frequently invited to speak at family-oriented events and charity functions, where he was introduced and received not as an actor, but as a genuine moral leader. This total merging of actor and persona provided Collins with the ultimate defensive fortress. By becoming the literal face of television morality, Collins engineered a reality where accusing him of a heinous crime seemed as absurd as accusing a genuine religious leader. The television industry, driven by ratings and advertising revenue, was more than happy to perpetuate this illusion. The network built its entire brand identity around the wholesome, family-friendly image projected by Seventh Heaven. Collins was the cornerstone of this corporate strategy. Therefore, the institutional imperative of the network, the studio, and the public relations apparatus was to protect and amplify his image as a saintly figure. Any whisper of impropriety, had it existed within the industry at the time, would have been met with fierce resistance from an ecosystem that relied on his pristine reputation for financial success. Behind this impenetrable wall of corporate protection and public adoration, the reality of Stephen Collins was vastly different. The man who spent his days filming scenes where he gently corrected the minor moral failings of his television children was harboring a dark history of inappropriate conduct. The contrast is so severe that it borders on the surreal. He weaponized societal shortcuts. He understood that a prestigious education, a respectable profession, and a warm smile on a television screen were all he needed. By performing the role of the good man flawlessly in public, he ensured no one would look behind the curtain. The elite foundation he established in the 1970s, combined with the unparalleled moral authority granted to him by the television industry in the 1990s, created a perfect storm of invulnerability. He was insulated by class, by education, by professional reputation, and finally by mass cultural adoration. He had built a life that was functionally immune to scrutiny. As he entered the new millennium, sitting atop a television empire built on the concept of family values, he had every reason to believe that the secrets of his past were permanently buried, protected by the very facade he had so carefully constructed. Collins's long marriage to actress Faye Grant also formed part of the stable public image surrounding him during much of his career. They married in 1985 and remained together for more than 2 decades before their relationship ended in a highly contentious divorce. When they married in 1985, they were instantly packaged by the media as the antithesis of the standard, volatile Hollywood couple. They were presented as grounded, committed, and entirely immune to the rampant dysfunction that typically defined celebrity unions. Throughout the astronomical rise of Seventh Heaven, Grant stood by his side on red carpets and in magazine spreads, providing the necessary visual confirmation of his patriarchal television persona. A man who plays the ultimate moral compass on television must be seen going home to a flawless marriage. Grant, whether she fully realized it at the time or not, was the cornerstone of his camouflage. The public logic was unassailable. A woman of her standing would never tolerate a monster in her home. Therefore, the man must be a saint. However, the architecture of this domestic shield was fundamentally compromised by a secret so dark it defies basic human comprehension. Behind the closed doors of their affluent Los Angeles estate, the marriage was harboring a profound, festering betrayal. The timeline of his admitted misconduct, spanning incidents in 1973, 1982, and 1994, overlapped directly with their courtship and marriage. But the true horror of his actions was not just the misconduct itself, it was the proximity of the victims. As it would later be shockingly revealed during the unraveling of their lives, one of the young girls Collins targeted and abused was a direct blood relative of Faye Grant. This specific detail elevates the narrative from a standard Hollywood scandal to a study in profound psychological violence. Collins did not just seek out vulnerable strangers. He utilized the trust embedded within his own extended family unit to access his victims. He weaponized his status as an uncle, a trusted family member, and a revered television star to manipulate a child from his wife's own bloodline. The audacity required to sit at family dinners and pose for holiday photographs, while hiding what he had done to her relative, reveals a chilling ability to divide his life into impenetrable compartments. For years, this devastating reality remained buried under the weight of his fame and his manipulative control over the family narrative. But a secret of this magnitude inevitably damages the foundation it is buried in. By 2012, the 27-year marriage had reached an untenable breaking point. Collins, perhaps feeling the absolute invulnerability that comes from decades of unchecked power and public adoration, made the decision to file for divorce. In the insular world of Hollywood, a high-asset divorce is rarely a simple legal procedure. It is a hostile corporate dissolution. The decision to file for divorce was the catalyst for his own destruction. By initiating the separation, Collins voluntarily dismantled the primary defensive wall that had protected him from scrutiny. He transitioned his wife from a silent, cooperative partner into a direct legal adversary. When a partnership built on dark secrets fractures, the fallout is never contained to just financial assets. The divorce proceedings quickly deteriorated into a ferocious, bitter dispute over the division of their massive combined wealth, accumulated largely during his tenure on Seventh Heaven. Faced with the prospect of a brutal public trial and seeking to manage the increasingly volatile dynamic with his estranged wife, the couple agreed to attend joint psychotherapy sessions in January 2012. Inside that room, the tape rolled silently as the therapist guided the conversation. Collins detailed incidents dating to 1973, 1982, and 1994, acknowledging inappropriate physical contact involving underage girls. He walked out of that session believing he had maintained his position of power, continuing his television work on shows like Revolution. But that recording remained a ticking time bomb. On the 7th of October 2014, the celebrity news outlet TMZ bypassed PR spin and published the audio. There was no buffer. The public was given direct, unfiltered access to the raw evidence. The 7th of October 2014 fundamentally altered the paradigm of celebrity scandal. Prior to the digital age, the destruction of a public figure was typically a gradual process, managed through carefully worded press releases, negotiated interviews, and the slow churn of print media. But the internet operates on an entirely different velocity. When the celebrity news outlet TMZ published the clandestine therapy recording of Stephen Collins, there was no buffer, no PR spin, and no time for the entertainment industry to construct a defensive narrative. The public was given direct, unfiltered access to the raw evidence. The immediate public reaction was not merely shock. It was a phenomenon akin to mass betrayal trauma. For 11 years, millions of households had utilized Seventh Heaven as a moral compass. The character of Reverend Eric Camden was deeply embedded in the cultural psyche as a paragon of virtue. Hearing the actual voice of the man who inhabited that character, the same soothing, authoritative baritone that had delivered countless television sermons, casually dissecting his history of misconduct against underage girls, induced severe cognitive dissonance. The audio file stripped away the illusion instantly. The audience was forced to confront the terrifying reality that they had welcomed an individual with a history of misconduct into their living rooms, trusted him with their family's entertainment, and allowed his image to shape their understanding of American morality. The entertainment industry responded quickly. UPTV removed Seventh Heaven reruns from its schedule, while companies associated with Collins began distancing themselves from him. The decision reflected the severe reputational problem created by the contrast between Collins' admitted conduct and the family-oriented program with which he was most closely identified. The series itself did not disappear entirely, but the scandal permanently altered the way Collins' role in it was perceived. The purge extended rapidly across the industry. At the time the scandal broke, Collins was actively employed. He had been cast in a prominent role in the high-profile comedy sequel Ted 2, directed by Seth MacFarlane. Major studio features are massive financial investments, and studios are ruthlessly pragmatic regarding liabilities. Universal Pictures and the production team did not hesitate. Collins was summarily fired from the production. The scenes he had already filmed were entirely scrapped, and the production absorbed the financial loss of reshooting the material with a different actor. He was excised from the project with surgical precision, leaving no trace of his involvement. Furthermore, the institutional structures of the acting profession moved to expel him. Collins had long maintained a position of authority within his own union, serving on the National Board of Directors for SAG-AFTRA. This position conferred immense respectability and influence within the industry. Following the publication of the audio, the pressure from the union membership and the board was immediate and overwhelming. He was forced to resign his position, stripping him of his final remaining shred of professional dignity and institutional protection. In the span of a single news cycle, he went from a working, respected industry veteran to an absolute pariah. For Collins, this rapid expulsion from the industry was a brutal collision with a reality he thought he had successfully outrun. He had spent his entire adult life accumulating institutional power, believing his status as a union board member and a beloved television patriarch made him untouchable. Watching his legacy evaporate overnight completely dismantled the lifelong narrative of his own invincibility. He could no longer rely on his Amherst diction or his leading man charm to negotiate his way out of the crisis. The master manipulator was finally cornered, stripped of every single tool he had used to deceive the world. The destruction of his career was absolute, triggering severe collateral damage across the industry. The sudden removal of Seventh Heaven from television syndication impacted the residual income of the entire cast. The true financial security for television actors lies in residual payments. For a show that runs for 11 seasons, these checks act as a permanent pension. Removing reruns from television schedules destroyed this reliable income stream for the entire cast. Removing reruns from television schedules could also affect residual payments received by performers, although the precise financial impact on individual cast members is not publicly established. For actors who had spent years working on Seventh Heaven, the scandal nevertheless affected the commercial and cultural afterlife of the program through no action of their own. The psychological toll on his television family was equally devastating. The actors who played the Camden children had spent thousands of hours working intimately with Collins. They had looked up to him as a mentor and a father figure, both on and off the set. The revelation of his true nature was a profound personal trauma. When the news broke, the silence from the cast was initially deafening as they processed the shock. Eventually, they began to speak out, expressing a uniform sense of absolute disgust, betrayal, and heartbreak. They were forced to publicly distance themselves from the man who had been the central figure in their professional lives. The show that had defined their youth, the work they had been proud of, was now permanently tainted. It could no longer be celebrated or viewed with nostalgia. It was inextricably linked to the actions of a figure hiding a dark past. As the entertainment industry ruthlessly severed its ties with Collins, the public expectation naturally shifted toward the judicial system. The audio recording published by TMZ was not an anonymous accusation or a piece of hearsay. It was a clear, unambiguous confession from the perpetrator himself. He had named the years, described the victims, and admitted to the specific predatory acts. To the average citizen, this was the definition of an open and shut case. The public braced for the inevitable sight of the former television patriarch being placed in handcuffs, perp walked in front of the media, and subjected to a criminal trial. The reality, however, delivered a crushing lesson in the limitations of the American legal system. Following the release of the TMZ recording, both the Los Angeles Police Department and the New York Police Department immediately opened investigations. The jurisdictions were determined by where the admitted crimes had allegedly taken place. Detectives began the arduous process of attempting to identify the victims referenced in the tape, seeking corroborating evidence and building a criminal case. However, the investigators almost immediately collided with an impenetrable legal barrier, the statute of limitations. Investigators faced an important legal obstacle, the statute of limitations. These laws establish time limits within which criminal charges may be brought and vary according to jurisdiction, offense, and the law in effect at the relevant time. Cases involving misconduct toward minors can be especially difficult when they emerge decades later. By 2014, authorities investigating the incidents Collins had described faced limitation periods connected to conduct dating back to the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. As a result, the existence of the recording did not automatically produce criminal charges. Collins was neither acquitted by a jury nor cleared of the conduct he later acknowledged. Rather, authorities faced legal limits on prosecuting incidents that had occurred many years earlier. In December 2014, Collins publicly addressed the allegations in a written statement provided to People magazine. He acknowledged inappropriate conduct involving 3 underage girls over a period of roughly 2 decades, apologized for his actions, and said that he had undergone therapy years earlier. The statement came after the recording had already become public and after investigators had begun examining whether criminal charges remained legally possible. By that stage, significant statute of limitations issues had already emerged. The statement did not restore Collins' reputation. Instead, it confirmed in his own words that the central allegations surrounding the recording were substantially true. Collins also appeared in a televised interview with Katie Couric in December 2014. During the interview, he rejected the label of perpetrator and described himself instead as having experienced an exhibitionist compulsion. He also discussed the therapy he had received and said that the behavior had not continued in later years. The distinction he drew between different clinical terms became one of the most controversial parts of the interview. Rather than ending discussion of the scandal, the appearance generated further criticism because much of the conversation focused on how Collins described his own conduct. The interview did little to reverse the professional consequences that had already followed the release of the recording. By the end of 2014, Collins' association with the image of Reverend Eric Camden had been permanently transformed. After the 2014 scandal, Collins' acting career effectively ended and his public appearances became increasingly rare. He also left the Hollywood environment that had defined much of his professional life. He later settled in Fairfield, Iowa, a small city known in part for Maharishi International University and its association with transcendental meditation. Compared with his decades as a highly visible television actor, Collins began living a substantially more private life. There is little reliable public evidence describing his ordinary interactions with local residents, so claims about how people reacted to him in shops, streets, or other public places should be treated cautiously. What can be established is that his public profile declined dramatically and that his career never returned to its former position. Collins now wanders the quiet streets of Fairfield, stripped of the one resource he relied on most, the adoration of an audience. Without a script to perform or a camera to capture his carefully rehearsed empathy, he is left entirely alone with the reality of his actions. He built his entire self-worth on the reflection of his own greatness in the eyes of millions, a mirror that has now permanently shattered. Every mundane interaction in that small town is a glaring reminder of the global stage he forfeited through his own predatory arrogance. The television father who once guided millions is now a ghost haunting his own ruined legacy. Despite this crushing isolation, Human psychology is remarkably resilient in its pursuit of self-preservation. Even the most universally reviled individuals will attempt to construct a micro-reality where they are not viewed as a monster. For Collins, this attempt at reconstructing a sustainable reality materialized in 2019, when, at the age of 72, he quietly remarried. His union with a significantly younger woman added a complex layer to his exile. To survive such a marriage, a new spouse must often adopt a heavily sanitized version of the disgraced figure's history, accepting semantic deflections like exhibitionist rather than perpetrator. For Collins, this relationship became a vital psychological lifeline. Stripped of his audience, his colleagues, and his institutional power, he required at least one individual to serve as a mirror that reflected a human being rather than a monster. The marriage allowed him to retreat behind the walls of his Iowa property and engage in a facsimile of normal domestic life. It provided a buffer against the devastating silence of his isolation. Inside his home, he could momentarily pretend that the Katie Couric interview never happened, that the TMZ tape did not exist, and that he was simply a retired actor living out his twilight years in the quiet Midwest. However, this micro-reality is extraordinarily fragile, constantly threatened by the unrelenting pressure of the modern media landscape. The true horror of Collins' modern exile is that the cultural machine that once protected him now actively sustains his infamy. The Collins scandal occurred several years before the Me Too movement became a major global force in 2017. In retrospect, his case became part of a broader public reassessment of how the entertainment industry responded to allegations of misconduct involving powerful or well-known figures. Furthermore, this cultural reckoning birthed a massive, highly lucrative sector within the entertainment industry: the true crime investigative documentary. Streaming platforms and television networks realized that there was a boundless public appetite for the meticulous deconstruction of Hollywood's darkest secrets. The very industry that Collins had dedicated his life to, the industry that had once shielded him, now viewed him as highly valuable raw material for true crime content. This dynamic completely inverted the power structure of his life. As a powerful actor and a board member of SAG-AFTRA, Collins was accustomed to controlling his image. He dictated the terms of his publicity. In his exile, he was stripped of all agency. He became the prey for investigative journalists and documentary filmmakers. The rise of investigative documentaries focusing on entertainment industry scandals ensured that his past remained in the public eye. Decades later, media retrospectives continued to examine the collapse of his public image. Collins is now forced to endure the ultimate humiliation for a controlling image-conscious actor, watching strangers dissect his darkest secrets for profit. He cannot call a director to adjust the lighting or demand a rewrite of the script that now defines his entire existence. The very industry that once built his towering pedestal now meticulously deconstructs his pathology for true crime enthusiasts, turning his downfall into a permanent, highly visible indictment. He is trapped in a continuous media loop where he is perpetually cast as the villain, unable to speak, defend, or deflect. His silence is not a choice, but a life sentence imposed by the very culture he once sought to dominate. The filmmakers did not require his participation or his permission. They utilize archival footage, the TMZ audio, legal documents, and interviews with former colleagues who expressed their enduring disgust. They laid bare the mechanics of his hypocrisy for a new generation of viewers who were perhaps too young to remember the original scandal in 2014. The documentary relitigated his crimes with the clinical precision of a post-mortem examination. This continuous media cycle ensures that the walls of his invisible prison are perpetually reinforced. The residents of Fairfield, who might have slowly grown accustomed to his quiet presence, were abruptly reminded of the precise, horrific details of his past. The stares in the supermarket became sharper. The isolation grew deeper. He was forced to watch, entirely powerless, as his life was packaged, analyzed, and broadcast to millions as a cautionary tale of ultimate depravity. He could not issue a press release to combat the narrative. He could not book an interview to defend himself, as he knew from the Katie Couric disaster that any attempt to speak would only result in further self-immolation. His only option was absolute silence. The consequences of the 2014 revelations were lasting. Collins' acting career did not recover, and the public image he had built over several decades became inseparable from the conduct he acknowledged. The case also exposed a striking gap between legal accountability and public judgment. Investigators examined incidents dating back decades, but limitation periods created substantial barriers to prosecution. That legal outcome did not erase Collins's admissions or restore his former standing. For viewers who had known him primarily as Reverend Eric Camden, the contrast remained particularly difficult to ignore. For 11 seasons, Collins had portrayed a father and minister whose authority rested on trust, responsibility, and moral guidance. After 2014, those performances were inevitably viewed through a different lens. That may be the most lasting aspect of Stephen Collins's story. An actor can become closely identified with the values of a fictional character, but the character and the person playing him are not the same. Collins's career demonstrated how powerful that distinction can become when a carefully trusted public image collides with facts that audiences were never expecting to learn. Today, Collins is in his late 70s and has largely remained outside public life. His years as one of American television's most recognizable fathers remain part of television history, but they are now inseparable from the revelations that ended his career.